A couple demanded child support after begging me to become their sperm donor. I was 26 and working as a physical therapist when my coworker Jason asked me for the biggest favor of his life. He and his wife Lindsay couldn't have kids, and they'd spent $40,000 on fertility treatments that didn't work. They wanted to try with a known donor instead of going through a sperm bank because Lindsay had this thing about knowing where the genes came from. Jason knew I ran marathons, had a master's degree, no family history of diseases, all the stuff they were looking for. I felt bad for them, so I agreed to help. We went through a fertility clinic to do everything legally. I signed a donor agreement stating I had no parental rights or responsibilities. They signed the same agreement. The clinic had us do counseling sessions to make sure everyone understood what this meant. Lindsay cried during the paperwork signing, saying I was giving them the greatest gift anyone could give. Jason shook my hand and promised they'd never ask me for anything else ever again. The whole process took 3 months, and Lindsay got pregnant with twins on the second try. I was happy for them. We stayed friendly at work. And when the babies were born, Jason showed me pictures like any proud dad would. I sent a nice baby gift, and that was that. For 3 years, everything was completely normal. The kids were growing up. Jason would mention little milestones at work sometimes, and Lindsay would wave when she picked him up from the office. Then Jason got promoted to regional manager, which meant a big pay increase, but also way more travel. He was gone 3 weeks out of every month. Lindsay started calling me to complain about how hard it was raising twins basically alone. I'd listen politely, but kept boundaries clear. She started asking if I wanted to meet the kids since I was technically their biological father. I said no, that wasn't appropriate. She got upset and said I was being selfish. After that, things got weird fast. Lindsay would show up at my apartment building and wait for me to come home from work. She'd have the twins with her and try to force interactions, saying the kids deserved to know where they came from. I told her this violated our agreement and made me uncomfortable. She said the agreement was just paper and biology was forever. Jason was never around for these encounters because he was always traveling. When I told him what was happening, he said Lindsay was just stressed and I should be more understanding. Then Lindsay started telling people I was the twins' father, not donor father. She'd bring them to my gym, my grocery store, places she knew I'd be, and loudly tell strangers that the kids were meeting their dad. People would look at me like I was some deadbeat avoiding responsibility. I had to switch gyms and start shopping across town. 6 months into this nightmare, I got served with legal papers. Lindsay and Jason were requesting child support. They claimed that since I'd been acting as a father figure by being in the children's lives, I'd established a parental relationship. The evidence they provided was photos Lindsay had taken of me in public places where the kids happened to be, which she'd brought them to on purpose. They also claimed financial hardship because Jason had actually been fired 2 months ago for expense report fraud, but they'd been hiding it. They wanted $2,000 a month in child support backdated to the birth. My lawyer said even though we had an ironclad donor agreement, the fact that Lindsay had created these situations could complicate things. The fertility clinic still had all our records and documentation. But here's where Lindsay messed up. During our mandatory counseling sessions 3 years ago, the clinic had required us to make statements on video about our understanding of the donation process. I'd forgotten about these videos, but my lawyer hadn't. We requested copies from the clinic. The videos showed Lindsay explicitly stating she understood I would have no parental obligations, that she would never seek support, and that she was entering this agreement without coercion. But the really damaging part was where she joked to the counselor that if things got tight financially, she knew she could never come after me because the agreement was bulletproof. The counselor had reminded her this was a serious legal matter, and Lindsay had apologized, saying she understood. Completely. The fertility doctor who'd overseen our case was still at the clinic. When he found out what Lindsay and Jason were trying to do, he was furious. Turns out they'd been bad-mouthing the clinic to other potential patients, saying the clinic hadn't properly protected them from predatory donors. The doctor provided an affidavit about their behavior and revealed that Lindsay had actually contacted 2 other donors from the clinic trying to establish contact for potential support claims. At the preliminary hearing, Lindsay tried to cry about how hard it was being basically a single mom. The judge asked why Jason couldn't pay support if they were separated. That's when it came out that they weren't separated at all. Jason was still living with Lindsay, which meant their whole story about me becoming some kind of replacement father was complete garbage. The judge's face changed when she heard that, like she'd just figured out someone was trying to trick her. Lindsay's lawyer started talking really fast, trying to explain why they were even in court if both parents lived together and could support their own kids. The judge held up her hand to make him stop talking and asked him directly why Jason couldn't just get a new job instead of trying to get money from me. Lindsay's lawyer shuffled his papers around and said something about how hard the job market was, but you could tell even he knew how bad this looked. The judge wrote something down on her notepad, and I saw her shake her head a little bit, like she was annoyed at having to deal with this case at all. I sat there watching Lindsay's lawyer try to fix the mess they'd made. He started saying that even though Jason and Lindsay lived together, Jason being unemployed meant the kids needed extra financial support no matter what our agreement said. He kept using words like best interests of the children and financial hardship, but it all sounded fake now that everyone knew they'd lied about being separated. Quentin stood up holding a thick folder, and his voice was really calm when he spoke. He reminded the judge that we had video recordings from the fertility clinic where Lindsay said very clearly that she understood I would never have to pay anything. He said the recordings showed Lindsay knew exactly what she was signing, and even joked about how she could never come after me for money because the agreement was too strong. The judge looked interested and asked to see copies of the videos. Quentin handed some papers to the court clerk and said the clinic still had the original recordings if the court wanted to watch them. The judge looked at the papers Quentin gave her for a few minutes while everyone in the courtroom sat quietly. Then she said she wanted to take a break and watch the videos in her private office before making any decisions. She told everyone we'd come back in 2 hours and left through the door behind her desk. Quentin leaned over and whispered to me that this was actually good news. He said judges really hate it when people try to trick the system by making up fake stories about their situation. He said the fact that the judge wanted to see the videos herself meant she was taking our side seriously and wanted to make sure she had all the facts before throwing out their case. I felt a little bit better hearing that, but I was also nervous about waiting 2 more hours to find out what would happen. During the break, I went out to the hallway and sat on one of the wooden benches. Jason was sitting on a bench on the other side of the hallway with Lindsay and their lawyer. Jason wouldn't look at me at all. He just stared at his phone or the floor. Lindsay kept crying and talking to her lawyer, but she was talking loud enough that other people waiting for their court cases could hear her. She kept saying things about how hard it was to raise twins alone and how expensive everything was and how she didn't know what they were going to do. But now that the judge had caught them lying about being separated, her crying just seemed like she was putting on a show. Some people in the hallway looked at her with sympathy at first, but then they'd glance over at Jason sitting right next to her, and you could see them realize something didn't add up. A few people even gave me looks like they felt bad for me instead of for her. The 2 hours went by really slowly, and I kept checking my phone to see what time it was. When we finally went back into the courtroom, the judge looked serious and a little bit angry. She asked Lindsay to stand up and then asked her directly about the part in the video where she joked about coming after me for money if things got tight financially. Lindsay started crying again and said she was just making a joke and didn't really understand how serious everything was back then. But the judge interrupted her and said that wasn't true. The judge said the counselor in the video had explained very clearly how serious the legal agreement was, and Lindsay had apologized for joking and said she understood completely. The judge said the video proved that everyone involved knew exactly what they were agreeing to, and there was no confusion about it. Lindsay tried to say something else, but the judge told her to sit down. Then the judge looked at Lindsay's lawyer and said she'd seen enough evidence to make a decision. The judge said she was throwing out their whole case because they had no legal grounds to ask me for child support. She said the donor agreement was valid and binding, and the video evidence proved everyone understood what they were signing. Then she said that because Lindsay and Jason had brought a case that had no merit and had lied about their living situation, they had to pay all my legal fees. Lindsay started crying really hard, and this time it didn't sound fake at all. She sounded scared and upset, like she'd just realized how much trouble they were in. Jason finally showed some emotion and put his face in his hands. Their lawyer tried to say something about how they were just trying to do what was best for their children, but the judge said that lying to the court was never acceptable, and she was done listening to their excuses. She signed some papers and told the clerk to give copies to both lawyers. Then she left the courtroom. Quentin gathered up all his files and told me we could go. Outside the courthouse, Quentin explained that what just happened was only the first hearing, and technically Lindsay and Jason could try to appeal the decision. But he said that with the video evidence and the judge being so clear about their case having no merit, no reasonable lawyer would tell them to keep fighting. He said we should still be ready for them to try something crazy since they were obviously in bad financial shape and desperate. He told me not to respond if they tried to contact me directly and to let him know right away if they did anything. I thanked him and shook his hand, then walked to my car feeling relieved but also completely exhausted. My whole body felt tired like I'd been holding tension for hours, which I guess I had been. I drove back to the physical therapy clinic where I worked, getting there about an hour before my next patient appointment. My supervisor, Theodora, saw me come in and came over to ask how the court hearing went. When I told her the judge threw out their case and made them pay my legal fees, she actually gave me a hug right there in the office. She said everyone at the clinic had been worried about the situation and talking about how unfair it was that I was punished for trying to help someone. She said she was glad the legal system recognized that I hadn't done anything wrong. A couple of my coworkers heard us talking and came over to say congratulations, which made me feel a little awkward but also supported. I went to my office and tried to focus on getting ready for my afternoon patients, but my mind kept going back to the courtroom and seeing Lindsay's face when the judge made her decision. That evening, my best friend Callan showed up at my apartment with Chinese food and beer. He'd been texting me all day asking how things went, and I'd sent him quick updates, but now he wanted to hear the whole story in person. I told him everything that happened, including the part where it came out that Jason and Lindsay weren't even separated. Callan kept shaking his head and saying he couldn't believe how stupid they were to think they could get away with lying to a judge. He reminded me that he'd been telling me from the start that I didn't do anything wrong by helping them have kids. He said some people are just manipulative and will take advantage of anyone who tries to be nice, and that wasn't my fault. We ate the food and watched basketball on TV, and for the first time in months, I felt like maybe things were actually going to be okay. Callan stayed until almost midnight just hanging out and having him there. Made me feel less alone in dealing with all this. 2 days later, I was at work with a patient when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I ignored it until the session was over, then checked and saw 3 missed calls from Quentin. I called him back right away and he said he had news. Lindsay's lawyer had contacted him that morning wanting to talk about a settlement. They wanted to drop the whole case completely and never bring it up again, but only if I agreed to let them off the hook for the legal fees the judge ordered them to pay. Quentin said this told him they were really desperate and knew they had no chance of winning if they kept fighting. He asked me what I wanted to do and said we could talk through the options. I told him I needed some time to think about it and would call him back later. Part of me wanted to make them pay every dollar they owed me just to teach them a lesson, but another part of me just wanted this whole nightmare to be over with so I could move on with my life. I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what Quentin said. $8,000 was a lot of money, but dragging this out for months sounded worse than just letting them walk away. That evening, I called him back and told him I wanted to talk through the options in person. We set up a meeting for the next morning at his office. When I got there, Quentin had a legal pad covered in notes about collection procedures and enforcement mechanisms. He walked me through everything. If I pursued the full amount, we'd file a motion to enforce the judgment, which could take 6 weeks just to get a hearing date. Then if they claimed they couldn't pay, the court might set up a payment plan that stretched out for years. They could also file for bankruptcy, which would probably wipe out the debt entirely since it wasn't child support or taxes. The whole time we'd be dealing with this, Lindsay could keep showing up places or making my life difficult in ways that weren't technically violations of any order. Quentin said the other option was to use the judgment as leverage. They clearly wanted this to go away badly enough to reach out about settlement. We could offer to waive the fees in exchange for an agreement that actually protected me long term. I asked what that would look like and he started listing terms. No contact whatsoever except through attorneys if absolutely necessary. No claims of any parental relationship between me and the children in any context, public or private. No future support claims of any kind, with specific language that waived any rights under state law. Penalties for violations that would include contempt of court charges. I told him that sounded better than chasing money I'd probably never see. He said he'd draft something and send it to Lindsay's lawyer by end of business. 3 days went by without any response. I started to think maybe they decided to just ignore the judgment and deal with whatever consequences came later. Then, Quentin called and said they'd signed everything. He filed the settlement agreement with the court that afternoon, making it legally binding. He explained that if Lindsay or Jason violated any terms now, I could file for contempt and they'd face serious consequences. For Jason especially, with his expense fraud conviction, any contempt finding could mean actual jail time. The judge wouldn't be sympathetic to someone who'd already proven they'd lie and cheat the system. I felt this huge weight lift off my shoulders when Quentin told me it was done. Not just the case being over, but knowing I had real legal protection now instead of just hoping they'd leave me alone. That same afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, worried it might be Lindsay trying one last thing. But it turned out to be Rodney, the fertility doctor from the clinic. He said he'd heard the case was resolved and wanted to apologize personally for what I went through. I told him it wasn't the clinic's fault, but he insisted they should have caught the warning signs earlier. He said they were changing their whole process because of my situation. New donors would have to go through extra counseling sessions. There'd be a longer waiting period between agreement and procedure to make sure everyone really understood what they were signing. They were adding specific language about harassment and stalking to the agreements. He thanked me for not blaming the clinic or bad, mouthing them publicly, because apparently Lindsay and Jason had been telling people the clinic set them up with a predatory donor. I told him I appreciated the call and was glad something good might come from this mess. Work started feeling normal again over the next few weeks. People stopped giving me those curious looks in the hallway. A few coworkers who'd heard bits of the story through the grapevine would ask if everything worked out okay, and I'd just say it was resolved and leave it at that. Theodora was great about shutting down any gossip she overheard. I heard her tell someone in the break room that my personal legal matters were private and resolved, and everyone needed to focus on their own work. She didn't say it mean, just firm enough that people got the message. But I noticed I wasn't sleeping great. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning thinking about the whole situation, replaying conversations with Lindsay or moments in the courtroom. During the day, I felt fine, but at night, my brain wouldn't shut off. After about 2 weeks of this, I mentioned it to Theodora during a check-in meeting. She asked if I'd considered talking to someone professionally. I'd thought about therapy before, but never actually done it. She said the clinic's insurance covered mental health services and gave me some names of therapists other staff had worked with. I picked one who specialized in dealing with betrayal and violation issues. The first session was weird, sitting there trying to explain the whole sperm donor situation to a stranger. But the therapist, this woman in her 50s with a really calm voice, just listened without judgment. She said what I was feeling made complete sense given what happened. People I'd trusted had turned on me and tried to exploit my kindness. That kind of betrayal messes with your ability to trust your own judgment about people. Over the next few sessions, we talked about boundaries and how my instinct to help people were actually a good thing. The problem wasn't that I'd helped Jason and Lindsay. The problem was they'd violated an agreement and tried to manipulate me. She helped me see that protecting myself legally wasn't selfish or mean. It was necessary and healthy. She also pointed out that I'd actually handled everything really well. I'd kept boundaries with Lindsay when she started getting inappropriate. I'd documented things. I'd gotten a good lawyer. I'd fought back instead of just giving in to make it go away. About a month after the settlement, I stopped at a coffee shop near my apartment on a Saturday morning. I was waiting for my order when this guy approached me and asked if I was the person from the court case. My first reaction was panic, thinking maybe this was some friend of Lindsay's coming to harass me. But he quickly explained he was Eugene, one of the other donors Lindsay had contacted. Quentin had shared court documents with him as part of building the pattern evidence. He said he wanted to buy me a coffee and thank me for fighting back. We sat down and he told me his story. Lindsay had reached out to him about 2 years ago through the fertility clinic, saying she needed updated medical history information for her friend's child. He'd donated through the clinic around the same time I had. At first it seemed legitimate, just questions about any new health issues in his family. But then Lindsay started calling more often, asking about his job and financial situation. Eventually, she suggested he should help out financially, since he was technically the biological father. She'd say things like how hard it was for her friend as a single mom, how the kid deserved support from their real dad. Eugene shut it down immediately and reported her to the clinic. That's how Rodney knew about her pattern of contacting multiple donors. Eugene said he'd been worried about her trying to sue him like she did to me, but after seeing my case get dismissed so completely, he felt better about his own situation. He said watching me fight back instead of just settling quietly probably saved him and maybe other donors from similar schemes. Learning about Eugene's experience helped me stop second-guessing myself. I'd been wondering if maybe I'd somehow led Lindsay on or given her mixed signals that made her think she could ask for money. But knowing Eugene had gone through the same manipulation helped me realize this was Lindsay's pattern, not something I'd caused. 3 months after their settlement, I heard through workplace gossip that Jason found a new job in a different city and they were moving away. The information came from someone in accounting who'd processed his final paycheck. Part of me felt relieved I wouldn't risk running into them at the grocery store or coffee shop anymore. But another part felt sad about how a friendship and goodwill gesture turned into such a nightmare. Jason and I used to grab lunch together every week before all this happened. We'd talk about sports and complain about difficult patients and make plans to go hiking on weekends. Now he was leaving town, and we hadn't spoken in months, except through lawyers. Theodora pulled me aside at work the following Tuesday morning before my first patient arrived. She closed her office door and sat down across from me with a serious expression. The clinic had received a reference request from Jason's new employer, and she wanted my input on how to handle it. My first instinct was anger, because after everything they'd put me through, Jason had the nerve to list our clinic as a reference. But then I thought about it for a minute and realized being vindictive wouldn't help me move forward. I told Theodora to be honest about his work performance, but don't mention the personal legal situation. Jason had actually been a decent physical therapist before he got fired for the expense fraud. His patients liked him, and he knew his stuff clinically. What happened between us was separate from his job skills. Theodora nodded and said she appreciated my maturity about the situation. She'd write a reference focusing solely on his clinical work and professionalism with patients. At my therapy session that Thursday, I mentioned the reference request and how I'd decided to handle it. My therapist pointed out that my choice to not sabotage Jason's new job showed I'd maintained my integrity despite how they treated me. She said that was important for my own healing, keeping my values intact even when others violated theirs. I could have easily told Theodora to write a terrible reference or mention the legal situation to his new employer. Nobody would have blamed me for that after what Jason and Lindsay did, but doing that would have made me feel worse, not better. It would have meant letting their actions change who I was as a person. The therapist said that kind of self-awareness and emotional regulation was a sign I was processing everything in a healthy way instead of letting anger consume me. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the fertility clinic informing me they'd updated their donor agreements with stronger language and additional protections based on feedback from my case. The new agreements included specific clauses about harassment, explicit prohibitions on donors being contacted for financial support under any circumstances, and mandatory video statements that would be stored permanently. They were also requiring more counseling sessions before approving any known donor arrangements. Knowing something positive came from this experience made it feel slightly less pointless. Maybe my nightmare would prevent someone else from going through the same thing. I called Quentin to tell him about the clinic's changes, and he said several other fertility clinics in the area had reached out to him asking about the case. They wanted to strengthen their own agreements, too. A few days after that, Amira reached out through Quentin to thank me for fighting the case publicly instead of just settling quietly. She said she'd been worried about coming forward to testify until my case showed the legal system would actually protect donors who followed proper procedures. Amira had donated through the same clinic about 4 years ago to help a friend have a baby. When Lindsay contacted her pretending to need medical information, Amira had gotten suspicious and shut it down immediately. But she'd spent months worried that Lindsay might try to sue her anyway. Seeing my case get dismissed so completely gave her peace of mind that her donor agreement would hold up if Lindsay ever came after her. Quentin forwarded me Amira's email, and I wrote back thanking her for being willing to testify. Her testimony about Lindsay's pattern had been crucial evidence. 4 months after everything ended, I finally felt comfortable enough to start dating again. I'd put my personal life completely on hold during the legal battle, too stressed and anxious to even consider meeting someone new. But now that the case was resolved and Jason and Lindsay had moved away, I felt ready to try. I downloaded a dating app and spent an evening setting up my profile. Choosing photos was weird because I had to think about what image I wanted to project. I picked pictures from a recent hiking trip with Callan and one from a work charity event where I looked professionally presentable. Writing the bio section was harder because I didn't want to come across as damaged goods, but I also didn't want to hide that I'd been through something significant recently. I matched with someone named Taylor, and we had a great first date at a local brewery. She worked as a graphic designer and had a good sense of humor. When she asked why I was single, I gave a vague answer about focusing on work and dealing with some stressful personal stuff that had recently resolved. I wasn't ready to explain the whole sperm donor legal nightmare to someone I just met. That seemed like way too much information for a first date. We talked about normal things like favorite movies and travel plans and what we like to do on weekends. The conversation flowed easily, and she laughed at my jokes. When we left the brewery 3 hours later, I felt hopeful about dating for the first time in months. By the third date with Taylor, I decided to tell her the basic outline of what happened because it felt dishonest to hide something that was such a major part of my recent life. We were having dinner at an Italian restaurant when I brought it up. I explained that I'd helped coworkers have children through sperm donation. They'd tried to sue me for support, and I'd won the case, but it had been incredibly stressful. Taylor listened carefully without interrupting and asked a few questions about the timeline and legal process. When I finished explaining, she said she appreciated my honesty. She thought helping someone have children were actually a kind thing, even though they took advantage. Her response made me feel better about sharing the story. She didn't treat me like damaged goods, or act weird about it. Callan noticed I seemed lighter and happier when we met up for basketball the following week. He said I was back to my old self instead of the stressed, anxious version I'd been for the past 6 months. During a water break between games, he joked that he was starting to forget what I was like before all this happened. It was good to have his friend back. I told him about Taylor and how dating was going well. Callan gave me a hard time about not introducing her yet, but I said it was still early, and I wanted to make sure things were solid before bringing her around my friends. He understood, but made me promise to bring her to his next cookout if we were still together in a few weeks. Work performance reviews came around in early November, and Theodora gave me excellent marks across all categories. She noted in writing that I'd handled an extremely difficult personal situation with professionalism and didn't let it affect my patient care. Several patients had specifically mentioned in feedback forms that I'd helped them make significant progress with their treatment plans. Theodora said she was impressed by my resilience through everything and recommended me for a leadership training program the clinic offered to senior therapists. The program would teach management skills and potentially lead to a supervisory role within the next year. Getting that recommendation felt like validation that my career had stayed on track despite the personal chaos. I accepted the opportunity immediately. The program started 2 weeks later with monthly workshops on team management, conflict resolution, and performance reviews. I sat in a conference room with 8 other therapists from different clinics, learning how to give feedback without making people defensive, and how to handle scheduling conflicts when everyone wanted time off during holidays. The instructor talked about documentation requirements and how to spot when someone on your team was burning out before it became a problem. During breaks, I talked with the other participants about their clinics and realized most places dealt with the same staffing issues and patient complaints we did. Having concrete skills to learn kept my mind busy instead of replaying the courtroom scenes over and over. 5 months after signing the settlement, an official notice arrived in the mail, stating the appeal window had closed and the case was permanently resolved. I read the legal language 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. Quentin sent an email that same afternoon congratulating me and saying I never had to worry about this issue again. He added that if Lindsay or Jason ever contacted me for any reason, I should document it immediately and call him. The email felt like closing a book I'd been forced to read for too long. I saved it in a folder on my computer labeled legal stuff and tried to let the relief actually sink in. That weekend, I took myself to a nice steakhouse downtown to celebrate the official end. I sat alone at a table by the window watching people walk past on the sidewalk. The waiter brought a ribeye with garlic mashed potatoes, and I ordered a whiskey to go with it. Sitting there eating slowly, I thought about how different I was now compared to when Jason first asked me to be a donor. Back then, I'd said yes without really thinking through all the ways it could go wrong. Now I knew that helping people were good, but protecting yourself legally was just as important. I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off instead of ignoring warning signs because I didn't want to seem paranoid. The whole experience taught me that some people would take advantage of kindness if you let them, and that wasn't my fault for being kind. It was their fault for being manipulative. 2 months into dating Taylor, we had the conversation about making things official. We were at her apartment watching a movie when she paused it and said she wanted to know where we stood. I told her I wanted to be exclusive, and she smiled and said she'd been hoping I'd say that. She brought up the donor situation and said she admired how I'd handled everything with integrity, even when it would have been easier to just pay them to make it go away. She said my experience actually taught her something important about legal protections when helping others. Her brother had been thinking about lending money to a friend without any paperwork, and she told him what happened to me and convinced him to get a proper loan agreement. Knowing something good came from my nightmare made it feel slightly less pointless. A month after becoming official with Taylor, I started volunteering at a legal aid clinic downtown every other Saturday. The clinic helped people who couldn't afford lawyers understand contracts and agreements before signing them. My experience with the donor agreement made me want to help others avoid similar situations. The clinic director paired me with an attorney named Margaret, who reviewed documents with clients and explained what everything meant in plain language. My job was to share my story when it seemed relevant and encourage people to ask questions even if they felt stupid. Most clients were relieved to hear from someone who'd learned the hard way why legal protection mattered. At the clinic, I met a young woman who was pressured by her sister to co-sign a car loan. She felt guilty saying no because family was supposed to help each other. I told her about Jason and Lindsay and how helping friends or family without proper protections could destroy relationships and cause legal nightmares. Margaret explained that co-signing made her fully responsible if her sister stopped paying and showed her the contract section that proved it. The woman decided to say no and came back 2 weeks later to thank us. Her sister was mad at first, but eventually got the car on her own, and their relationship survived because there was no financial resentment. Being able to guide people away from bad situations felt meaningful in a way my regular job didn't always provide. During my 6-month review, Theodora called me into her office and closed the door. She said the leadership training was paying off because I'd been helping newer therapists with difficult patients and taking initiative on scheduling problems. Then she told me she was promoting me to senior physical therapist with 3 people reporting to me. The raise was 15% and came with a small office instead of just a desk in the shared workspace. She said she was impressed by my resilience through everything and that my career had stayed completely on track despite the personal chaos. Getting that validation from someone I respected made me feel like I'd actually survived the nightmare instead of just endured it. The additional responsibility felt like proof that I was moving forward instead of staying stuck in what happened. 2 weeks after the promotion, Taylor finally met Callan at a barbecue he was hosting. I'd been nervous about introducing them because Callan had seen me at my worst during the legal battle, and I wasn't sure how he'd act around her. But they hit it off immediately, talking about hiking trails and arguing about whether the city needed another coffee shop on every corner. During a moment when Taylor went inside to get drinks, Callan pulled me aside and said she must be special since I was actually introducing her to friends instead of keeping my personal life locked down like I had during everything with Lindsay and Jason. He said it was good to see me trusting someone again and letting them into my life. His approval mattered more than I expected it to. 6 months after the settlement, I realized during a meeting at work that I hadn't thought about Jason and Lindsay in weeks. The constant background anxiety that used to wake me up at night had faded so gradually, I didn't notice it disappearing. I could walk into grocery stores without scanning for them. I didn't check my mailbox with dread anymore. My shoulders didn't tense up every time my phone rang. The harassment campaign they'd put me through had defined my life for so long that not thinking about them felt strange at first, like forgetting something important. But then I realized that forgetting them was actually the goal. They didn't deserve space in my head anymore. A message came through the fertility clinic's secure portal from a couple asking if I'd consider being a donor for them. My immediate reaction was panic and a hard no. I closed the message and tried to forget about it, but it kept nagging at me. During my next therapy session, I brought it up, and my therapist asked why I was so opposed to even considering it. I said obviously because of what happened with Lindsay and Jason. She pointed out that one bad experience with manipulative people didn't mean everyone who needed a donor was going to exploit me. She asked if I'd stop being a physical therapist if one patient sued me, and I said no, that would be different. She said it wasn't actually that different, that sometimes helping people involved risk, but that didn't make the help less valuable or mean I should never help anyone again. I spent the next week thinking about that couple's request through the clinic portal. Every time I opened my laptop to respond, my hands would freeze over the keyboard. The message sat there unanswered while I went through my daily routine at work, treating patients and supervising my small team. During lunch breaks, I'd pull up the message and read it again, looking for red flags or signs that these people might turn into another Lindsay and Jason situation. But the message was straightforward and polite, just explaining their situation and asking if I'd consider helping them. I couldn't find anything wrong with it, which somehow made me more nervous. Finally, I called Quentin and asked if he had time to meet about something that wasn't urgent but was important to me. He cleared an afternoon slot 2 days later, and I showed up at his office with the message printed out. Quentin read it carefully while I sat across from his desk fidgeting with my phone. He looked up and asked what I was thinking, and I admitted I didn't know. Part of me wanted to help because I knew how desperate people could get when they couldn't have kids, but another part of me never wanted to go through anything like the legal nightmare again. Quentin nodded and said those were both valid feelings, then asked what would make me feel safe enough to consider it. I thought about it for a minute and said I'd need protections that went way beyond the standard donor agreement. I wanted specific language about harassment, stalking, any attempt to establish a relationship with me or claim I was more than a donor. I wanted financial penalties built in if they violated the agreement, something that would hurt enough to make them think twice. I wanted it structured so that if they ever came after me for support or tried to involve me in the kids' lives, they'd face serious legal consequences immediately. Quentin pulled out his laptop and started taking notes, asking questions about specific scenarios I was worried about. We spent 2 hours building out an agreement that covered every situation I could imagine based on what Lindsay had put me through. He added clauses about social media, about bringing children to places I frequented, about making any public statements claiming I was a parent rather than a donor. He built in escalating financial penalties starting at $5,000 for first violations and going up from there. He included language that would allow me to get a restraining order fast if they started acting like Lindsay did. When we finished, Quentin leaned back in his chair and said this was probably the most comprehensive donor agreement he'd ever seen. He said it might scare off the couple who'd contacted me because it was so strict, but that was actually a good test. If they were decent people who genuinely just wanted a donor, they'd understand why I needed these protections and they'd sign without complaint. If they pushed back or tried to negotiate away the protective clauses, that would tell me everything I needed to know about their intentions. I asked him to send me the draft so I could think about it more. Walking out of his office, I felt better having the document exist, even if I never used it. At least now I knew what real protection looked like, and I wouldn't go into any future donation situation as naive as I'd been with Jason and Lindsay. 3 weeks later, Taylor suggested we take a weekend trip to the mountains. I hadn't taken any real vacation time in over a year, not since before the legal mess started. Work had been my safe place where I could focus on patients and forget about everything else happening in my life. But Taylor pointed out that I'd been carrying tension in my shoulders for months, and maybe getting away from the city would help me actually relax. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, taking a winding road through pine forests until we reached a small cabin rental she'd found. The place was basic but clean, with a fireplace and a deck that looked out over a valley. That first evening, we just sat on the deck with beers and watched the sunset, not talking much, just being present. I realized how quiet it was compared to the city. No traffic sounds or sirens or people shouting on the street. The next morning, we hiked a trail that led to a waterfall, and somewhere during that hike, I noticed I wasn't thinking about the lawsuit or Lindsay's harassment or any of it. I was just focused on the physical act of climbing, watching where I put my feet on the rocky path, feeling my muscles work. When we reached the waterfall, Taylor sat on a boulder and I sat next to her, both of us catching our breath. She asked if I felt different being away from everything, and I admitted I did. Being in the mountains made the whole nightmare with Jason and Lindsay feel smaller somehow, like it was just one thing that happened rather than the defining event of my entire life. That night, we cooked dinner in the cabin's tiny kitchen, and Taylor told me she loved how I'd turned such a terrible experience into motivation to help other people through the legal aid volunteering. She said watching me take something that could have made me bitter and using it to protect others showed real strength. She said that kind of growth was rare, that most people who got hurt just stayed hurt. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just pulled her close and kissed her forehead. Later, lying in bed listening to the wind and the trees outside, I thought about what she'd said. The legal battle with Lindsay and Jason had forced me to develop boundaries I'd never had before. I'd learned to protect myself, to say no, to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate me. Those skills had been painful to learn, but they'd made me stronger. And now with Taylor, I could actually be present in a relationship instead of being so open and trusting that I let people take advantage. I fell asleep feeling grateful for where I'd ended up, even though the path to get here had been awful. On Sunday morning before we drove back to the city, Taylor and I had breakfast on the deck. She was reading something on her phone and smiling, and when I asked what was funny, she said her best friend had just gotten engaged. I congratulated her and she looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Then she said she was really happy we'd found each other, that she felt lucky to be with someone who'd been through hard things and come out better instead of worse. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling something shift inside my chest. It wasn't just attraction or comfort or companionship anymore. I was falling in love with her, actually in love, and I was finally in a place emotionally where I could handle that. The legal nightmare had taught me how to protect myself while still being open to good people, and Taylor was definitely good people. Driving back to the city that afternoon, I realized I wasn't the same person who'd agreed to help Jason and Lindsay 3 years ago. That version of me had been too trusting, too willing to help without thinking about consequences, too naive about how people could twist good intentions. The new version of me was more careful but not closed off, protective of myself but still willing to connect with others. And those qualities actually made me a better partner because I wasn't bringing unresolved trauma or poor boundaries into the relationship with Taylor. Monday morning, I walked into the clinic feeling more rested than I had in months. My first supervisee meeting was with a woman named Rachel, who'd been working under me for about 6 weeks. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup and not making eye contact. I asked what was on her mind, and she said she had a personal situation she wanted advice about. A close friend had asked her to co-sign a loan for $15,000 because the friend's credit was bad. Rachel felt obligated because they'd been friends since college, and the friend was really struggling. But something about the request made her uncomfortable. She wanted to know if I thought she was being selfish by hesitating. I leaned back in my chair and thought about how to answer. Then I told her the basic outline of my donor situation, leaving out the most personal details, but explaining how I'd helped someone I trusted and how that trust had been completely violated. I said the hardest lesson I'd learned was that protecting yourself legally and financially isn't selfish. It's necessary. Even with people you care about, maybe especially with people you care about, you need clear boundaries and proper protections. I explained that true friends wouldn't ask you to put yourself at risk, and if they did ask, they'd understand if you said no. Rachel listened carefully and asked if I regretted helping my coworker at all. I thought about it and said I regretted not protecting myself better, but I didn't regret trying to help. The problem wasn't the helping, it was the lack of boundaries and legal protection. I told her that if she wanted to help her friend, she should do it in a way that didn't put her own financial security at risk, like offering a smaller gift she could afford to lose rather than co-signing a loan that could destroy her credit if things went wrong. 2 days later, Rachel stopped by my office to thank me. She said she'd decided not to co-sign the loan, but had offered her friend $1,000 as a gift instead. The friend had initially been upset and said Rachel didn't trust her, but Rachel had held firm and explained she was protecting their friendship by keeping financial obligations separate. Eventually, the friend had accepted the gift, and their relationship had actually gotten stronger because they'd been honest with each other about boundaries. Rachel said having permission from someone she respected to prioritize her own well-being had made the decision easier. She'd been feeling guilty about wanting to say no, but hearing my experience had helped her see that protecting yourself isn't the same as being selfish. I felt good about that conversation for days afterward. If my nightmare with Lindsay and Jason could help even one person avoid a similar situation, then maybe it hadn't been completely pointless. The following weekend, Callan called and asked if I wanted to grab drinks. We met at our usual bar, and he seemed excited about something, bouncing his leg under the table while we waited for our beers. Finally, he pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of an engagement ring. He'd proposed to his girlfriend Hazel the night before, and she'd said yes. I grabbed him in a hug and told him congratulations, genuinely happy for him. He and Hazel had been together for 4 years, and I'd watched their relationship grow steadier and stronger over time. Then Callan asked if I'd be his best man, and I felt my throat get tight. Standing up in his wedding felt like more than just a normal best man duty. It felt symbolic of how far I'd come. From the isolated, anxious person I'd been during the legal battle to someone who could fully show up for the important people in my life again. I told him I'd be honored, and he ordered a round of shots to celebrate. Later that night, walking home from the bar, I thought about how much had changed in the past year. I'd gone from being harassed by Lindsay and fighting a fraudulent lawsuit to being in a healthy relationship, helping others through legal aid work, supervising a team at work, and standing up as best man in my best friend's wedding. The legal nightmare had taken up so much space in my life for months, but now it was just background context, something that happened but didn't define me anymore. The next week, I got an email from Quentin inviting me to a donor rights seminar he was helping organize. The event would bring together attorneys who specialized in reproductive law and fertility specialists to discuss legal protections and ethical considerations around sperm and egg donation. Quentin said he thought I might find it interesting given my experience, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to share my story with the group. My first instinct was to say no, because talking about what happened with Lindsay and Jason still felt raw sometimes. But then I remembered how good it felt when Rachel told me my advice had helped her, and I thought maybe sharing my experience could help protect other donors from similar situations. I emailed Quentin back and said I'd attend, and I'd be willing to speak if he thought it would be useful. The seminar was held at a hotel conference room downtown on a Saturday morning. About 40 people attended, mostly lawyers, but also some doctors and clinic administrators. Quentin introduced me during the section on donor agreement enforcement, explaining that I'd successfully defended against a fraudulent support claim because of proper documentation and legal protections. I stood up and told my story, starting with agreeing to help Jason and Lindsay and walking through the escalating harassment, the lawsuit, the video evidence that saved me, and the final settlement. People took notes, and several raised their hands with questions afterward. One attorney asked what I wished I'd known before agreeing to donate, and I said I wished someone had explained that even ironclad agreements might not stop desperate people from trying, but proper documentation would protect me when they did. A fertility doctor asked if I'd ever consider donating again, and I admitted I wasn't sure, but if I did, I'd want protections that went far beyond standard agreements. That led to a productive discussion about what additional clauses should be standard in donor contracts, with several attorneys taking notes on the specific protections Quentin had drafted for me. After the formal presentations ended, people came up to talk to me individually during the lunch break. 3 different attorneys asked for my contact information so they could use my case as an example when advising their own clients about donor agreements. One lawyer said she'd had a client go through something similar, but without the video evidence to protect them, and that client had ended up paying support for years before finally getting the case overturned on appeal. Hearing that made me realize how lucky I'd been that the fertility clinic had required those counseling videos. If Lindsay hadn't made that joke about coming after me if finances got tight, if the counselor hadn't corrected her on camera, I might have lost my case despite the written agreement. A clinic administrator from another state asked if I'd be willing to speak at their staff training about the importance of thorough documentation and counseling. I said I'd think about it, still not entirely comfortable with the idea of my nightmare becoming a teaching tool, but understanding that it could help protect others. By the end of the seminar, I felt good about attending. Knowing my experience was used to improve standard practices and help other donors protect themselves gave the whole nightmare a sense of purpose. It wasn't just a terrible thing that happened to me anymore. It was a cautionary tale that could actually make the system better for everyone involved. That evening, Taylor came over to my apartment, and I told her about the seminar while we cooked dinner together. She listened to everything and then said she was proud of me for being willing to share something so personal if it meant helping others. I kissed her and said I'd learned from the best, meaning her, because she'd been the one encouraging me to channel the experience into something positive through the legal aid volunteering. We ate dinner on my couch, watching a movie neither of us paid much attention to, and somewhere during the evening I realized we'd been together for 6 months. 6 months of healthy, stable, drama-free relationship that felt completely different from the chaos that had defined my life when we first met. I mentioned the 6-month milestone, and Taylor laughed, saying I'd been the most drama-free boyfriend she'd ever had. We both cracked up at that given everything I'd been dealing with right before we met, but she said she meant it. Despite the legal nightmare being fresh when we started dating, I'd never brought that chaos into our relationship or used it as an excuse for bad behavior. I'd kept my problems separate and dealt with them like an adult instead of making them her responsibility. That comment made me think about how much I'd grown through the whole experience with Lindsay and Jason. I'd learned to handle my own stuff, to maintain boundaries even when things got hard, to protect myself while still being open to good people like Taylor. Those lessons had been painful to learn, but they'd made me into someone capable of having a healthy relationship. Lying in bed that night with Taylor asleep next to me, I felt genuinely happy for the first time in over a year. The legal battle was over, my career was thriving, I had real friends like Callan who showed up when things got tough, and I was in love with someone who made me want to be better. Lindsay and Jason had tried to destroy my life for their own financial gain, but instead they'd accidentally pushed me toward becoming a stronger, wiser, more careful version of myself. I fell asleep thinking that sometimes the worst things that happen to you end up teaching you exactly what you needed to learn. 2 weeks later, Theodora called me into her office with a serious expression that made my stomach drop. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit down, then pulled out a folder with information about a specialized physical therapy program across the country. The program focused on sports medicine and rehabilitation techniques that only 3 facilities in the nation offered, and they wanted me to apply for their year-long fellowship that could lead to a permanent position as their lead therapist. The opportunity was incredible, the kind of career move most therapists only dreamed about, but it meant relocating to a completely different state and leaving everything I'd built here behind. Theodora said she'd received the recruitment letter and wanted me to know about it even though losing me would hurt the clinic, because she believed in supporting her staff's growth even when it meant letting them go. I took the folder home and spent the evening reading through the program details, my mind spinning with possibilities and complications. The salary was higher than what I made now. The facility had cutting-edge equipment, and the professional development opportunities were unmatched. But moving meant leaving the support system that had carried me through the worst year of my life, leaving the clinic where I'd finally established myself as a leader and potentially disrupting the first healthy relationship I'd ever had. I called Taylor that night and asked if she could come over because I needed to talk about something important. She arrived 20 minutes later with concern written across her face, probably worried something had gone wrong with the legal settlement or Jason and Lindsay had violated the agreement. I showed her the folder and explained the opportunity, watching her process the information while I tried to gauge her reaction. She asked questions about the program, the location, what the job would involve, and then she asked the question I'd been afraid to bring up, which was what this meant for us. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that we'd only been together 6 months, but those 6 months had been the best part of the past year, and I couldn't imagine making this decision without considering where our relationship was headed. Taylor was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, if I wanted to take the opportunity and thought it was the right move for my career, she would seriously consider moving with me. The statement hung in the air. Between us, heavier than either of us expected, because it meant we were talking about a future together, about making major life decisions as a team instead of as individuals who happened to be dating. I asked if she was sure, if that was something she'd actually want, or if she was just saying it to be supportive, and she said she'd been thinking about our relationship a lot lately, and she could see a real future with me. We spent the next 2 hours talking through what moving would mean, the logistics of her finding a new job, leaving her family and friends, starting over in a place where neither of us knew anyone. The conversation was practical and emotional at the same time, weighing career opportunities against relationship stability, professional growth against personal connections. By the time Taylor left that night, we'd agreed I should seriously consider the offer, and we'd make the decision together based on what felt right for both of us, not just my career. Over the next week, I researched the program extensively, talked to therapists who'd completed it, and tried to imagine my life in a completely different city. The professional side made perfect sense. The opportunity was genuinely once in a lifetime. But every time I pictured myself there, I felt a knot in my stomach about leaving everything familiar behind. I'd finally reached a place where I felt stable and secure, where I had real friends like Callan who'd proven their loyalty, where I had a job I loved, and a supervisor who believed in me, where I had Taylor and the life we were building together. Starting over somewhere new meant risking all of that for potential career advancement, and I wasn't sure the trade-off made sense anymore. I met with Theodora again and told her I was leaning toward declining the offer, that I appreciated her bringing it to my attention, but I'd realized I wanted to stay and continue building my career here. She nodded slowly and said she understood. Then she asked if I had a few minutes because there was something else she wanted to discuss. Theodora explained that she'd been planning to announce this at the next staff meeting, but given my decision about the fellowship, she wanted to tell me first. She was planning to retire in 2 years when she turned 65, and she'd been thinking carefully about who should replace her as clinic director. She said I was her first choice, that she'd watched me handle the situation with Jason and Lindsay with incredible professionalism, that I'd grown into a natural leader who the other therapists respected and came to for guidance. The vote of confidence hit me harder than I expected, bringing unexpected tears to my eyes, because Theodora had seen me at my absolute lowest point when the legal battle was consuming my life and I could barely function at work. She'd supported me through that nightmare, covered for me when I needed time for court appearances, protected my reputation when gossip started circulating, and now she was saying she still believed in my leadership potential enough to want me running the entire clinic. I thanked her and said I was honored she'd consider me, that the opportunity to eventually become director was exactly the kind of career growth I'd been hoping to build toward. She smiled and said she'd known I'd make the right decision about the fellowship because I'd learned to value stability and genuine relationships over flashy opportunities that looked good on paper. That evening, I told Taylor about Theodora's retirement plans and her offer to groom me for the director position. Taylor hugged me and said she was proud of me for choosing to stay, that she could tell the decision felt right even though the fellowship had been tempting. We celebrated with dinner at our favorite restaurant, and somewhere between the appetizer and entree, I realized how grateful I was that the legal nightmare with Jason and Lindsay had taught me to value the right things. A year ago, I might have jumped at the fellowship without considering the personal cost, chasing professional achievement without weighing it against relationship stability and community connections. But going through that betrayal had taught me that having people you trust and a life you've built with intention matters more than impressive credentials or career advancement for its own sake. I'd learned the hard way that some opportunities aren't worth the sacrifice, that sometimes the best choice is staying where you're valued and continuing to grow in a place that feels like home. The next morning, I formally declined the fellowship and sent a thank you letter explaining that I'd decided to pursue leadership opportunities at my current clinic. The program director responded graciously, saying they understood and hoped I'd consider applying again in the future if circumstances changed. I forwarded the email to Theodora with a note saying I was fully committed to preparing for the director role and asked what steps I should take to develop the necessary skills. She responded within an hour with a list of business management courses offered through the local university's continuing education program, suggesting I start with classes on healthcare administration, personnel management, and financial planning for medical practices. I enrolled in 3 courses that started the following month, scheduled for 2 evenings a week after my clinic shifts ended. The coursework was challenging in a completely different way than physical therapy had been, requiring me to think about budgets and staffing and regulatory compliance instead of treatment plans and patient outcomes. Taylor noticed how stressed I was getting about balancing work, classes, and our relationship, so she started coming over on my class nights to help me study. She'd quiz me on financial terminology, help me work through case studies about managing difficult employees, and make sure I actually ate dinner instead of surviving on coffee and stress. Having a partner who actively supported my ambitions instead of creating drama or making demands felt like a gift, especially after experiencing how Jason and Lindsay had turned my attempt to help them into a weapon against me. Taylor never complained about the late nights I spent studying or the weekends I dedicated to assignments, never made me feel guilty for prioritizing my career development, never turned my goals into something that inconvenienced her. The contrast between her steady support and Lindsay's manipulative behavior couldn't have been more stark, and it made me appreciate even more that I'd found someone who wanted to build me up instead of tear me down for personal gain. 4 months into the management courses, Callan called to tell me he'd proposed to his girlfriend and they were getting married in 6 months. He asked me to be his best man, which meant giving a speech at the reception about friendship and loyalty and what it means to show up for people when they need you most. I agreed immediately, honored that he'd chosen me for such an important role, but privately, I worried about giving a speech that would inevitably make me think about Jason's betrayal and how different real friendship looked compared to what I'd thought we had. I spent weeks working on the speech, trying to find words that would celebrate Callan without being bitter about Jason, that would talk about loyalty without dwelling on betrayal, that would honor genuine friendship without referencing the fake version I'd experienced. The night of the wedding arrived and I stood up at the reception in front of 200 guests, looking at Callan and his new wife beaming at each other, and I talked about what it means to be there for someone during their worst moments. I said real friends don't disappear when things get hard. They don't make your problems about themselves. They don't use your vulnerability against you. I said Callan had shown me what actual loyalty looked like by standing beside me during a situation that could have been awkward or complicated, by listening without judgment, by reminding me I deserved better when I was doubting myself. Several guests came up to me afterwards saying my words had moved them, that they could tell I was speaking from genuine experience about the difference between surface-level friendships and the real thing. Nobody knew I was talking about Jason's betrayal and Callan's support. Nobody understood that every word came from recent painful experience. But the emotion was real, and people responded to that authenticity. Callan hugged me after the speech and whispered that he knew what I'd really been talking about, that he was grateful I'd turned our friendship into something meaningful instead of letting Jason's actions make me cynical about trusting people. 9 months after the settlement officially closed, I attended a medical conference focused on reproductive health and donor rights. I was walking through the exhibition hall looking at different clinic booths when I spotted Rodney from the fertility clinic where I'd done the donation 3 years ago. He recognized me immediately and came over to shake my hand, asking how I was doing and whether everything had worked out with the legal situation. I told him the case had been dismissed and settled, that Jason and Lindsay had signed an agreement never to contact me again, and that I'd moved on with my life successfully. Rodney looked relieved and said he'd been worried about me, that the whole situation had bothered him professionally because he felt partially responsible for not anticipating that someone might try to manipulate the system like Lindsay had. I assured him it wasn't his fault, that the clinic had done everything right with the counseling and documentation, and that without those videos, the case might have gone very differently. He told me the clinic had implemented new protocols since my situation, adding extra counseling sessions, longer waiting periods before approving known donor arrangements, and more explicit language in the agreements about harassment and contact violations. They'd also created a donor protection program that provided legal consultation if any disputes arose, ensuring future donors wouldn't have to navigate the system alone like I had. Rodney said my case had prompted necessary changes that would protect everyone involved, donors and recipients alike, and while he wished I hadn't. Had to go through that nightmare. At least something positive had come from it. I thanked him for the updates and said knowing the system was better now made the experience feel less pointless, like my situation had served as a warning that improved things for others. We talked for a few more minutes about the conference sessions and new developments in reproductive medicine, then exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. The conversation with Rodney stayed with me for days afterward, reinforcing what my therapist had been telling me about finding meaning in difficult experiences. The legal battle with Jason and Lindsay had been horrible, violating, and exhausting, but it had also taught me crucial lessons about boundaries, self-protection, and the difference between helping people and letting them exploit you. It had shown me who my real friends were, pushed me toward a healthier relationship than I might have settled for otherwise, and apparently improved the system for future donors who wouldn't have to face what I did. 3 weeks after the conference, Taylor and I started seriously discussing moving in together. We'd been dating for almost a year, spending most nights at one apartment or the other anyway, and it seemed like the natural next step. We looked at several places together, trying to find something that felt like ours, rather than one person moving into the other's established space. Eventually, we found a 2-bedroom apartment with good light, and enough room for both of us to have our own workspace, mine for studying clinic management materials, and hers for her graphic design projects. Moving in together felt significant, like we were building something real and lasting instead of just dating casually. Setting up our home together, deciding where furniture should go and whose dishes to keep and how to organize the kitchen, represented a fresh start built on trust and mutual respect instead of the chaos that had defined my life when we first met. I'd come so far from the anxious, betrayed person I'd been a year ago, and having Taylor beside me as I continued growing felt like proof that good things could come after terrible experiences if you did the work to heal and stayed open to new possibilities. 2 weeks after my conversation with Rodney, Taylor came home from work with an envelope tucked under her arm and that smile she gets when she's planned something special. She dropped the envelope on the kitchen counter while I was making dinner and told me to open it. Inside were registration confirmation and race bib pickup instructions for the Chicago Marathon, the one I'd mentioned months ago wanting to run before everything with Lindsay and Jason consumed my life. I stared at the papers, remembering how I'd stopped training completely during the legal battle, too stressed to even think about running. Taylor wrapped her arms around me from behind and said it was time to reclaim that part of myself, that she'd watched me give up something I loved because of people who didn't deserve that power over me. I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening to a room I'd locked and forgotten about. The next morning, I dug my running shoes out of the closet and went for my first real run in over a year. My legs felt heavy and my lungs burned after just 2 miles, but crossing back through my front door felt like winning something important. Over the next 4 months, I built my mileage back up slowly, running before work and on weekends, feeling my body remember what it used to know. Taylor ran shorter distances with me sometimes, and Callan joined me for a few long runs, both of them supporting this return to something that had always been mine before the nightmare tried to take it away. Race day arrived cold and clear, the kind of perfect fall morning that makes you grateful to be alive and moving. Taylor stood at mile 13 with a ridiculous homemade sign that said, "You're halfway to being done with this terrible idea," and I laughed so hard I nearly tripped. She showed up again at mile 20 when my legs were screaming and my brain was telling me to quit, holding a new sign that just said, "Keep going," in big letters. The last 6 miles hurt in ways I'd forgotten running could hurt, every step requiring a choice to keep moving forward instead of stopping. When I turned the final corner and saw the finish line, something broke open inside me that had nothing to do with the race itself. Crossing that line with Taylor screaming and jumping in the spectator section felt like proof that I'd survived everything, that Jason and Lindsay's betrayal hadn't destroyed the person I was before they tried to exploit my kindness. I collected my medal and found Taylor in the crowd, and she hugged me even though I was disgusting and sweaty, telling me she was proud of me for finishing what I'd started. 1 year after the settlement became official, I sat in my apartment looking at how different my life had become. Theodora had officially announced her retirement timeline and confirmed I was her choice for clinic director, which meant a significant raise and the chance to shape how we treated patients and supported our staff. Taylor and I had been living together for months, building a home that felt stable and safe, and nothing like the chaos that defined my life when we first met. Callan and his wife invited us over for dinners regularly, and I'd become close with several people from the legal aid clinic where I volunteered twice a month. Helping others understand their rights before signing agreements or helping friends had become something I was actually good at, turning my nightmare experience into useful knowledge that protected people from similar situations. The person I'd become through fighting Jason and Lindsay's exploitation attempt was stronger and smarter than the person I'd been before. Someone who understood that helping others and protecting yourself weren't opposite things but necessary partners. I'd learned the difference between kindness and letting people take advantage, between being generous and being a target, between helping someone in need and enabling someone's manipulation. Sitting there surrounded by the life I'd built after everything fell apart, I realized I was actually grateful for how it all turned out. Not grateful for the betrayal itself or the months of stress and violation, but grateful for what fighting back had taught me about standing up for myself and trusting my instincts. I'd helped Jason and Lindsay have their children when they needed a donor, fulfilled that promise completely and legally. When they tried to exploit that generosity and twist it into something it never was, I'd protected myself with the same legal structures we'd all agreed to in the beginning. The experience could have made me bitter or suspicious of everyone, could have convinced me that helping people always ends in betrayal. Instead, it taught me to be smarter about how I help, to protect myself legally while still showing up as someone who does good things for others. Some people will always try to take advantage of kindness, will always look for ways to exploit generosity for their own benefit. But that doesn't mean you stop being kind or stop helping people who genuinely need it. It means you get smarter about protecting yourself while still being the person you want to be in the world. I'd lost 2 friends I thought I could trust, but I'd gained wisdom about boundaries and self-protection that would serve me for the rest of my life. That seemed like a fair trade for everything I'd been through.